And what does it mean? Mapping is not simply drawing on a piece of paper, but it is also a certain form of exercise of power, creating identity, and it is including and excluding certain people. So Mahmoud Hanafi is one of the very prominent scholars on Afghanistan. His father is from Afghanistan. He is not born in Afghanistan. His mother is Lebanese American, I suppose. So he's a mix of Lebanese and American and Afghanistan origin. And I think he speaks Farsi and Pashto also. But good. In that talk, he also introduces his books. So I highly recommend some of his books. If you're interested, keenly interested on history of Afghanistan, he's one of the guys that you should take a look at it. And he's also connected in another way. It's not just about cartography and the maps that I introduced him to you guys, but he's also important in a sense that what we discussed today in terms of knowledge production, how history was produced on Afghanistan, how Afghanistan as an object of knowledge was constructed. So in a way, the philosophical standpoint or theoretical standpoint between him and today's chapter, which is Nivi Manchanda, the author of today's book, are same. Both of them are coming from a very critical standpoint, deconstructing the colonial knowledge on Afghanistan. So there is a connection between all of these. Let me first, before moving forward, I create a big picture and introduce what we are going to talk about it. And the entire chapter, probably we do not cover the entire chapter. I understand it was lengthy, and I didn't assign the entire chapter for you guys. So first, I will speak about the framework. What does she mean about relationship between knowledge and power? She talks her theoretical perspective is about relationship between power and knowledge, academia and military. Military is the power, and academia is the knowledge. That is the framework through which she tries to understand history of Afghanistan. Then we are going to only focus on two key metaphors that she speaks about. One is the graveyard of empire, how Afghanistan is always represented as graveyard of empire. Second one is the great game, Bozi Buzorg. She talks about pathology and disease, and she also picks another history book, Afghanistan 101, that I do not cover it in this talk and in this session. If you are interested, of course, feel free to read it. Now, what we are going to learn in this chapter. First, explain how knowledge production is implicated with imperial power. What she metaphorically uses the term Mars versus Minerva, the relationship between academia and relationship. So we will understand how history is knowledge, right? History is all about knowledge. How history is created by power. No one is neutral. History is not written by innocent people, right? So that's number one. Second, deconstruct three recurring tropes about Afghanistan. So those are graveyard of empire, great game, and pathology and disease. So this is the entire chapter tries to deconstruct, meaning that critique it. Third, analyze. This is the part that we will not focus. It's the last portion of the book, Ehsan's book on that she critiques. And finally, evaluate why cultural talk about Afghanistan. That some of, I think, Husnajan spoke about it. Forecloses political economic analysis. So most of these colonial knowledge on Afghanistan looks at Afghanistan only through the lens of culture. Saying that these guys are backward, these are tribal, these are XYZ. So they do not see how certain economic factors, certain political factors influence history, influence behaviors, and the way Afghanistan was shaped. Now, she starts her chapter with two quotes, and these are heavily one on the left is heavily theoretical. It's quite difficult. Homi Bhabha, it is an Indian origin American professor of humanities and English literature. He is the founder of post-colonial studies, how to study colonialism, simply how to study colonialism. Okay, and I have assigned one very short clip for you guys on our syllabus. So I think that is which session is it? Yeah. So if I don't know how many of you have watched it, it is in the section, the very first last week, the meet and greet week. And there are two videos. One of them is 5-minute clip from Homi Bhabha, where he talks about how shall we understand history? Shall we understand history through eras or through transformation? Eras, for example, in Afghanistan, we say Dawre Zahir Shah, Dawre Dawood, Dawre Parcham, Khalq, Dawre Mujahideen. So this is studying history through eras. But he suggests we should study history through transformation. So that's a different thing. I will not go good depth on that. But what does he say? Homi Bhabha says here, and let me unpack this quotation for you. It is the force of ambivalence that gives colonial stereotype its currency. Colonial stereotype is the way how colonial powers understand, study, or make sense of another country, which is colonized. In this case, who was colonial? Colonial in 18th century was British, and Afghanistan was the colonized, isn't it? So what he means, force of ambivalence, what does it mean? Force of ambivalence, ambivalence means something in contradiction somehow, a mix of both attraction and repulsion, a mix of fear and desire. So that is force of ambivalence. He says force of ambivalence gives the colonial stereotype its currency. Currency means its value. Ensure its repeatability in changing historical and discursive conjecture. So such kind of knowledge is continuously repeated several times, both in history and in discourse. Reduce the effects of probabilistic truth and predictability. What does he mean by probabilistic truth? Probabilistic truth means something which is scientific. The science is probabilistic, right? Science and mathematics is based on probability, right? So it tries to project itself quite probabilistic and predictable. Also, something which is again scientific. I mean, everything which is predictable, it is scientific, which must always be in excess of what can be empirically proved and logically constructed. This kind of a stereotype. I mean, the knowledge about Afghanistan, for example, what is the stereotype here? Graveyard of empire, Qabristan Imperatoria. It is repeated extensively to the extent that it saturates our mind. It saturates the empirical knowledge, and people feel, oh, okay, because I have seen it 10 times or 20 times, that means it's truth. But actually, it's not truth. It is something. It's a stereotype which is created through certain forms of power. Now, what is one example of such a stereotype? There's another quotation that she starts her chapter with, and the quotation is the one on the right. So this one comes from a book called A Military History on Afghanistan. It's Stephen Tenner. What he writes about Afghanistan: left to their own device, Afghans engage in internecine battle and simply enjoy freedom, not the kind of enforceable by Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, or Communist Manifesto, but more ancient derivation, unbothered by government at all. Meaning that these people enjoy freedom, they want to be independent, but not in a democratic way. What does he means? Magna Carta is a Bill of Rights which was adopted in Britain in order to provide and limit the authority of the king and establish the parliament. Bill of Rights was also in Britain, and later on Americans, when they crafted their constitution, they added a Bill of Rights in it. Or Communist Manifesto. I mean, she tries to say, and this author, Stephen, tries to say that people of Afghanistan love freedom, but not in a very civilized way, that they sit together and then agree on constitution and say, okay, now we limit the power of the government on whoever is the powerful. And instead, they don't want to be governed at all, meaning that they are not civilized people, right? So that is a kind of a stereotype, exactly how Homi Bhabha talks about it theoretically here. You don't have to memorize Homi Bhabha in this case. Now, remember that he, at the beginning, we said that Nivi Manchanda tries to argue about the framework between knowledge and power. So what does she mean by knowledge and power? So she referenced another scholar who's also a British scholar. Nivi Manchanda is teaching in Cambridge University, by the way, Duncan Bell. So I think Duncan Bell is her colleague. So she quotes Bell that's saying that the social science stands at the nexus of power and knowledge in the modern world. Whatever you think of social science, sociology, anthropology, political science, public policy, development studies, whatever you study so far, right? They are all produced through a mediation of power. There is power involved in it. Knowledge is not neutral. Universities and other research institutions have generated, incubated, and helped disseminate forms of knowledge that have played a fundamental role in shaping the world in which we live. What we know about the world out there, about societies, about culture, about history, it's all created by institutions like universities. And universities are shaped, influenced by power. How? Who funds universities? Who funds research? Research is not free, isn't it? Research is done by a certain amount of budget and funding. And who funds these? So funding comes from where? Is it private money? Is it public money? Why the private money donates to universities? Or why governments sponsor certain programs, certain agendas? So it's all about power, that you should understand that knowledge is always produced by power. So Manchanda's method, what is it? Close read the text at the core of U.S. military cultural awareness strategy. In this chapter, she tries to critique how United States in the last 20 years during the Republic tried to understand Afghanistan. Her target, what is her target? The stock troops. Troops means genre of writing, either history. She picks history books, she picks anthropological books, she also picks popular culture, pictures, images, and talks about them. So that is the stocks of troops. And one influential book, so that is the history book that probably we will not cover in this session, that together constitute Afghanistan as a discursive regime. Now the term discursive regime, you might be puzzled by that. That is coming from her methodology. There's one methodology called discourse analysis. Discourse means, and Farsi, guftaman. This guftaman is not guftago between two people. It's not about communication. Discourse means not simply how knowledge is produced through power, what we discussed so far. That is discourse, meaning whatever you understand about the world out there, about society out there, that is a certain form of representation created by a subject. That is who? Researcher, we. So it means that the way that we understand society is not objective, right? It is not out there. Afghanistan as a graveyard of empire, for example, this is certain form of knowledge. It is always repetitively, it is given to us. Is it an objective truth? Is it really out there like this? A discourse analysis framework says, no, that's not the case. Afghanistan as an XYZ or whatever graveyard of empire or a great game, it is part of representation of power, representation in a way that knowledge is constructed for us. Constructed by who? But maybe through intersubjective relationship, an interaction between subject and object. Subject here is the researcher, and a researcher or university, right? So again, it comes, who funds the university? That the subject comes with a certain form of power. The subject has knowledge. Whoever has knowledge, they have power. The subject also have resources. They have money, budget, XYZ. And the ones who are studied, like Afghanistan, poor people, they don't have anything. So a group of people comes and studies Afghanistan continuously the way that they want, right? That is her framework. Now, this is how we can depict the academia, which is university. It feeds what one example that she gives, the military academic complex, is establishment of, apologies, humanitarian system. Humanitarian system was what? It was a knowledge system which was created by the US Department of State during the war in Afghanistan, and they basically hired anthropologists, the ones who knew Afghanistan, in order to simplify and teach the soldiers what is Afghanistan, what kind of country is this. Because if you want to fight a people or in a country, you have to understand it, right? You cannot fight with unknown enemy, isn't it? So what they do, they try to hire that one. And it is not just the US creating such a kind of department or system called humanitarian system, where social scientists were embedded in the combat. But it goes back to the colonial time. And long back, for example, when Napoleon in France, when they attacked Egypt, what Napoleon did? He brought with himself from Paris a group of scholars who knew Islam, who knew Arabs and Egyptian culture, in order to help him in his fight in Egypt. That is later on, that kind of body of knowledge later on was called what? Colonial, Oriental studies. Oriental means the Eastern people, how to understand Eastern people. Entire Middle East, Asia was Oriental for them. Am I clear on this? I hope I've clarified it. Now, humanitarian system was critiqued by some people because the way some of these anthropologists produced knowledge about Afghanistan, they were not accurate. So the Department of Defense, meaning Ministry of War now, dismantled it. But still, two scholars, two historians, Marsden and Hopkins. Marsden is a British and Hopkins is an American. They found out that still, even if that was dismantled later on, in another military base, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas state in the United States, they established something else called Global Cultural Network in 2014. So again, the Global Cultural Network did the same thing, embed social scientists within the war environment in order to produce knowledge about it. So one example that she gives is, remember the humanitarian system, they were all anthropologists or sociologists. They knew how to study society and people. So anthropology, by definition, is all about tick description. This terminology, tick description, means what? It gives a detailed information about a group of people. Let's say if they want to study Kurds, right, or Baluchs, for that matter, or anyone in Afghanistan, let's say Tajiks, the Hazaras or Pashtuns, they give very detailed information about what is the language of Tajiks, how they eat, what kind of clothes they have, where they live, what is their religion, what is their skin color, what is their culture, how they celebrate Nowruz, how they celebrate Barat, how they celebrate Eid, X, Y, Z. So very detailed, very in a small bits or pieces of information which you may not even consider important, they provide information. So that's called tick description in anthropology. Now, that is the nature of anthropology as a discipline of knowledge. But when it comes to war, when it comes to HTS, the way US Department of State embedded and humanitarian system, that was not the thing. They provided 10 anthropology, meaning very, very little information. And that was misleading. What was 10 anthropology? So they also call it mercenary anthropology, meaning that a discipline of anthropology which was in the service of a mission, which was military fiction. And this term is coined by Robert Gonzalez. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania here in the United States. He coined this term, missionary anthropology. What does it mean? That is geared towards training soldiers, aid workers, NGO staff, not sustained scholarship. It's not about providing very good quality knowledge or scholarship. It is just to create manuals, very short manuals to distribute it for the soldiers to just quickly understand what is Afghanistan. And if things are short, you cannot explain it properly, right? And if there are misleading informations, there is not contradictory opinions. So, for example, someone can compare two different opinions with it. It is the most widely read and circulated literature on Afghanistan, and so continues to inform policy. Imagine how many people were involved in the last 20 years post-Bonn agreement in Afghanistan, foreigners, thousands of troops, thousands of aid workers, thousands of international NGOs. And so many of them didn't know enough about Afghanistan. So they quickly needed a kind of pamphlet kind of thing to just read in 10 minutes and understand Afghanistan. Unlike 10 anthropology, which was embedded in the war, the other side of the column here on the slide is tick description, which is by one of the founding fathers of anthropology, Clifford Geertz. They are not producing this kind of knowledge, the real anthropologists. What they do is sustain ethnographic engagement with context, meaning, and contradictions, meaning that an anthropologist may live for years, for months in a community, dedicate their life to one community. Clifford Geertz was studying in Bali, Indonesia. He lived in Bali, Indonesia for years in order to understand culture of Balian people. So they are employing ethnography, and they are very much engaged with that context, with meaning with that society there. They require fieldwork, language, time. Any anthropologist who studies somewhere, they should understand the language of people. But in 10 anthropology, They didn't know our languages. They were just reading stuff in English. So that's why what is produced here is quite harmful. But it's not just about anthropology. Even good scholarship, she says, reproduces things. I don't know how many of you know Thomas Barfield. If you have taken a course on history of Afghanistan, most of history of Afghanistan is with other professors. They have at least one reading from Thomas Barfield. Or sometimes they read Thomas Barfield's book cover to cover. Our next session is from Thomas Barfield. So it's a very good book on Afghanistan. But to Nivi Manchanda, even he also produced a kind of cliched knowledge on Afghanistan. For example, what he says, when he talks about the wars in 1980s and 1990s, after the Soviets' intervention and after the communist regime fall in Afghanistan, what he says, it was not the result of some Afghanistan's penchant of blood feud or tribal rivalry, although these did play a part. So how they understand Afghanistan, they say always these people are fighting with each other because of the tribal differences with each other, but rather the predictable consequences of having armed and funded political military factions in Pakistan. So he says, well, it was funded by Pakistan, but at the same time, one cannot neglect how much tribal rivalry existed between these people also. So he says, despite the fact that he is a very good scholar, but he also somehow reproduces the same form of knowledge. Now, let's talk about the two tropes that she wants to deconstruct. The first one is graveyard of empire. So, of course, each of us has heard it so many times we have read it in books or in media, Qabristan Imperatoriyas, Afghanistan. Now, she says that there are three problems with this understanding. It is ahistorical, meaning that it relies on selective evocation of history. Selective, meaning that it picks those parts of history that it likes, and then it disregards those episodes of history which it doesn't deserve or it doesn't like it. So selective means treats Anglo-Afghanistan war as a preordinate gigs of charging Afghanistan future. That is ahistorical. When we are selectively picking history, meaning that we are not honest with history, that is ahistorical. Ahistorical means that there is no change throughout history. From top to bottom, everything is the same. Go back to thousands of years ago, Afghanistan was graveyard of empire, then come down to the last 10 years, again, Afghanistan was graveyard of empire. Nothing changed. So that is ahistorical. Second problem is geographically deterministic. What does it mean? It constructs the terrain itself as a menacing and unconquerable. Meaning Afghanistan is mountainous, it's a difficult terrain, and no one can conquer this. And people are quite rough here in Afghanistan. That is deterministic, meaning that everything is specified from earlier. No one can change such a thing. And then it is racialized, meaning that it looks at Afghanistan through a lens of race. Remember the first quotation that she puts in her book? I think this was the one, right? This quotation, which is on here. How he talks about Afghanistan. He says, people are loving freedom, but it's not up through a kind of Bill of Rights or Magna Carta. They don't want to be governed at all. This is racial, right? Because it argues that only Europeans or only white people can establish government, can establish constitution, can establish Magna Carta, can establish Bill of Rights to limit the government. Others cannot do it, and Afghanistan cannot do it because these people doesn't know how to do it. So Afghanistan people are cast as inured to hardship and belligerent. And everyone, usually these historical textbooks also paint Afghanistan as a Pashtunwali and martyrdom. Everyone wants to kill each other, and everyone is following Pashtunwali. Of course, Afghanistan is quite diverse, and not all Afghanistan is following Pashtunwali code of conduct. Even Pashtunwali code of conduct is not same within Pashtun tribes also. It differs from places to places. So it's overall three key arguments that she has, and now point by point she tries to prove where this idea came from. So now she references a very famous magazine, Foreign Affairs. I don't know if you have read any article from this magazine. So this article was written in 2001, right before the United States invaded Afghanistan. And the author, Milton, what does he argue? So he talks about Afghanistan here. This spot, perhaps more than any other, has witnessed the traverse of world great armies. All eventually ran into trouble into their encounters with unruly Afghan tribal. Alexander the Great spent his supply train through the Khyber and then skirted northward with his army to Kunar Valley in his campaign in 327. There he ran into fierce resistance and struck by an Afghan archer arrow, barely made it into the Indus Valley with his life. Genghis Khan and the great Mongol emperor began passing through the Khyber a millennia later and ultimately established the greatest empires, but only after reaching painful accommodations. So again, what you look at it is ahistorical. The term ahistorical that Nivi Manchanda says, it is clearly visible here. Why? Because the author talks about Alexander the Great, which is 327 year BC, and then comes down to 13th century and talks about Genghis Khan. And both of them are analyzed the same way. Alexander the Great couldn't do it. Genghis Khan did it, but very difficultly, right? And then when you look at history of Afghanistan about Britishers, the same guy, Milton Bergman, when he talks about 9/11, he reminds them that, okay, be careful where you're going. It is really impossible to fight over there. So that's one example. And then what Nivi Manchanda tries to argue is to show alternative facts, that what we so far it is depicted is not true. All empires who fought in Afghanistan, they were not necessarily defeated. So British invaded Afghanistan at least 3 times, right? The first one was in 1839. Only that is the time that they were defeated. The first war, they were defeated, wherein they brought Shah Shuja, and then people assumed that Shah Shuja is puppet, and everyone revolted against Shah Shuja, and Britishers were defeated. The 2 other wars, historical facts, shows that Britishers were not defeated. They won the war. The second war, which was in 1887, they won the war, and they signed the Treaty of Gandamak. And in this Treaty of Gandamak, Yaqub Khan, son of Sher Ali Khan, he gave up certain control over some of the districts, like Koram, Mangi Kotal, and Khyber, and all that. Why did he sign the contract? Because he was defeated by Britishers. And the third war, which is 1919, so usually we say, oh, we won this war and Afghanistan got independent. But again, it was, for Britishers, it was a tactical win. They, again, in the treaty which was signed after this war in Rawalpindi, where Mahmoud Tarzi was the foreign minister of Amanullah, he went to Rawalpindi to sign the agreement. And that they reaffirmed the border between Afghanistan and the British Empire back then. So the border was signed, they acknowledged it, they accepted, but in exchange they gave Afghanistan independence. Afghanistan, back then, even Britishers were not interested to stay in Afghanistan. Remember, 1919 was after the First World War. Just First World War finished 1 year ahead in 1918. And almost everyone was exhausted in that war in Europe. So that is about Britishers. And in terms of Soviet also, she contradicts the point that, well, Soviets were defeated and it was only Afghans who fought this war, and they were the ones who should be celebrated. Why not? So we will come to each of these one by one. The first one is myth of the sole survivor, Dr. Bryden. So I'm sure that you have also read about this in history at school, how Dr. Bryden was the only survivor of the first Britishers' invasion of Afghanistan. He was the one who was injured, and then this painting depicts him. So Nivi Manchanda tries to unpack what's going on here. So she says that this is a painting by Lady Butler in 1879, almost 30 years after the war. And the painting depicts William Bryden, which was an assistant surgeon, arriving alone. But facts shows that he was not the only survivor of the troops. There were many others also. But somehow, when we talk about the war is only simplified in a way that, okay, we would say everyone was massacred among the British army and Afghanistan won the war. Even well-known historian William Dalrymple, he is alive, he's also British, and he runs a podcast, so probably you might be interested in his podcast. It's called, I think, Empire. And he has a well-known book, The Return of the King. It's about Shah Shuja. The king here means Shah Shuja. He also talks about the same kind of myth of graveyard of empire. What he says, any conqueror will spend money, will shed blood, like the Britishers did in 1842, the first war, and the Russians did in 1888, and NATO did will do it. So again, do you see that it is a historical analysis? Britishers almost a century earlier, Russians 1 century later, and then NATO some 40 years later, they were all considered the same. Everything is the same. So that creates exceptionalization of Afghanistan. Meaning Afghanistan is the only unique case among all other countries, which is around 200 countries, right? They are all not this kind, but only Afghanistan can do this. But of course, there are other examples. Other nations has also done the same thing. For example, how Ethiopia defeated Italy in 1896. So Afghanistan is not the only exception that people will say that, oh, okay, that's something different. No, why Afghanistan was never colonized? So in terms of popular explanation, people explain it that it is because the terrain is unconquerable. People are fierce. It's very difficult to fight over there. People simply cannot be ruled from outside. So, I mean, in other words, they are very violent people. But when, as a scholar, you look at archives, what is her finding? Manchanda finds several things. Number one, British indecisiveness and lack of sustained interest. So she looks at some of these archival material in India office correspondence. And in all those documents, it seems that British were not interested in Afghanistan to occupy it and stay in it in 19th century. Why? There were 2 key reasons. First, Afghanistan was a very poor nation. It didn't have any resources, meaning that it was quite expensive for the Britishers to rule, and in return, it didn't have anything for Britishers. What should the Britishers done there? India was rich. India had so much resources. It's a wealthy nation, right? It's agriculturally wealthy. India was the largest economy in 19th century when Britishers occupied it. It was exporting silk, it was exporting cotton, and so many other things, right? grains. But Afghanistan is not if you look at it from a 19th century perspective, of course, it was not an industrial nation, but it was not also because it's mountainous, it didn't have sufficient resources. So imagine a country comes to Afghanistan and rules it spends money, but in returns, it doesn't gain anything. So meaning that the logical conclusion is that they were not interested in it. For example, in 1879, one British account, which was written by one British colonel, says that who also led a mission in Afghanistan in 1857, dismissed the country and British relationship as a waste of blood and treasure. It's waste of time and waste of treasure, waste of money. That is how Britishers understood. So that's a direct account of it. Now, the Soviets in Afghanistan. So yeah, of course, Soviets finally withdrew from Afghanistan. But what were the reasons? Were they really defeated militarily, or it was something different? How do we understand it? So what is the standard narrative? Standard narrative says that Mujahideen, united by faith and grit, ground down a superpower through sheer attrition. And that's why Ronald Reagan, the American president, he coined one day as an Afghanistan's Observance Day. That was 21st of March, 1983. What did he say? To watch the courageous Afghanistan freedom fighters battle modern arsenals with simple handheld weapons as an inspiration. But that was not the case. They didn't fight. Mujahideen didn't fight the British Soviet army with simple handheld weapons. The document shows, history shows that in 1986, CIA and Saudi Arabia both supplied almost 250 Stinger launchers and more than 500 missiles, Stinger missiles. And that was a game changer in the war. Without Stinger missiles, Mujahideen would have not been able to fight Soviets. For the first time, Soviets got trapped because technology changed. The Stingers were able to strike down Soviet planes. But even later on, Soviets adopted with the war. They got to know the technology, and then they were able to save the planes. Anyway, but Brzezinski, who was also America's national security advisor, he says the Saudi, the US, Egyptians, British, Chinese jointly armed Mujahideen. So it's not just Mujahideen alone fighting against the Soviet. It was the money, weapon, technology coming from so many other nations and engulfing Afghanistan into a war. The second understanding is that it's also sometimes in history when you read, it says Soviet Union's Vietnam, Afghanistan. Like, why was such? Because America was defeated at Vietnam in 1960s. Now Americans wanted to repeat the same thing for the Soviets. So if you look at it from this phrase and this angle, this reframes Mujahideen as a participants of political agents responding to foreign invasion, meaning that they are independent actors, they can decide on themselves. But it overlooks how radical, fundamentalist some of these factions of Mujahideen were. They were quite zealot, some of them, right? And it also, when we talk about Graveyard of Empire and the Soviets' defeat, it also foregrounds that the Cold War has a proxy dimension. Proxy means both sides were funding one superpowers, which were not directly fighting with each other, but they were equipping and financing and two war parties in Afghanistan. One was the Soviets were financing or equipping the Khalq and Parcham regime. On the other hand, the Soviets and Muslim Americans and the Muslim nation like Saudi and Pakistan, they were financing Mujahideen. So it was a proxy war. It was quite complicated. She tries to say that it was quite complicated. Anyway, so the third terub that she understands and she tries to examine is popular culture and public and policy discourses. So Cato Institute is one of the think tanks here in DC, a research institute. The white paper that they have produced later on in 2009, again, it warns America of the same thing, Graveyard of Empire. Some of the pictures and icons which were produced, cartoons which were produced, satires which were produced, it all caricature Afghanistan from the same angle. Rumsfeld, which was President Bush, Minister of Defense, he also talks about Afghanistan the same way. Countries have exhausted themselves funding that country meaning Afghanistan. But when she looks at the archives, at least there is nothing, even once there is no mention of Graveyard of Empire by the Britishers in 19th century. So it just popped up later on. So meaning that the term Graveyard of Empire is not historical. It was not used by the Britishers. It was not used also by Soviets. But later Americans, they have invented it, the term. So what is the advantage? What is the purpose, in other words, of this term? It forecloses debate, meaning that if defeat is preordained, there is little point asking what different policies might achieve. So you do not talk about several policies. Okay, there might be a mistake about how the war was waged, and instead you say, okay, historically Afghanistan was Graveyard of Empire, so it doesn't work anything. Second, it naturalizes failure, meaning that any setback comes proof of ancient course, rather than a specific analyzable decisions. Ancient course meaning Afghanistan from Genghis Khan till the time of Alexander the Great, it was the same. So you take it for granted. Third, erase agency, meaning that Afghanistan became a force of nature. They are not political human beings. They do not take a decision by themselves. Agency means that we are independent as a human being. We do things as we wish. by choice, not by nature. We are not violent by nature, like we are born that way, right? But here, Graveyard of Empire depicts Afghanistan, which doesn't have agency. It's a force of nature. And lastly, functions and calculated forgetting. What does it mean? The selective past excuses inattentive engagement with complex present. So past is selectively selected, right? Which means ahistorical. Only certain episodes are selected. For example, the way Soviets' defeat was narrated. Only, for example, looking at what President Reagan said, or only look at how people in Afghanistan fought. It doesn't make sense. You have to look at funding. Who sent the money? Who sent the Stinger missiles? Who sent the launchers? Who sent so many other things? So you have to understand history is quite complicated. So in the war against Soviets was very much global. It was not just Afghanistan locally fighting it. So that way, present is complex and past is complex. You have to understand that kind of complexity. That's number one. And quickly, the second one, the Great Game. And the Great Game idea, Afghanistan is always depicted as a buffer state between two empires, the Britishers in the south in the 19th century and the Russians in the north. So the idea here is that in the 19th century, there was constant rivalry between two empires, Russians and Soviets. So in order to prevent any kind of direct clash or war between these two empires, this troop argues that both of them agreed to have Afghanistan in between as a buffer state, so that they do not fight with each other. But actually, historically, that is not correct, Manchanda argues. But what is the problem? The problem is that the idea of Great Game, which explains 19th century relationship between Soviets, Russians, and Britishers, it is again used time and again. 1 century later, when the Soviets came, again the term of Great Game is used on Afghanistan. Or when the NATO and United States came, again people were talking about the new Great Game. Now earlier it was Britishers versus Russians. Now it is Americans versus Russians. This is also problematic. In order to understand how it's problematic, Nivi Manchanda traces where this term came from. Who for the first time coined this term? So for the first time, historian Nigel Allen, it shows that the term barely appeared in archive between 1834 and 1927. For 100 years, this term was barely used. So why people always say that the Britishers were in a game with Russians over Afghanistan, if the archives doesn't show it, the documents doesn't show it. So for the first time, this term was invented in a novel, not in a history book, in a novel by Kipling. And someone else used Kipling's terminology, Peter Pokrik. He used the term from a novel. So how problematic it is. You read history using metaphors from novel, from fiction. So that's why James Heva says the troop obscures the real relationship between science and empire behind a romantic, almost fictional narrative. In order to understand history of empire, which is Britishers or Russians, we look at it from a very romantic perspective, from a fictional narrative perspective. And that's problematic. Anyway, so what next? The relationship is like this. It starts with a novel, and then it is used 1 century later. The novel is written in 1900 almost. Down the line, almost 100 years later, another scholar uses the term from this novel, Koprik. And then it projects across history. It goes back to history. It is used in 1990, but then they use it to explain 19th century and the new Great Game, which they talk about present day, and between the Americans and the Soviets. But Manchanda cites from archival documents what she says. In 1874, Russian prince, they wrote to British counterparts, asking them to cooperate with each other. So in fact, what does it mean? It means that Britishers and the Russians, they were not continuously fighting with each other. In most of the time, they were seeking cooperation. They were working together side by side. So actually, the idea of the Great Game, which is always these two fighting, is not correct. Okay, and then if you look at it from the modern literature also, the idea of Great Game, another IR, international relations scholar, Alexander Wendt, also says that Afghanistan's identity is always constructed. Constructed means it is not natural. It is not out there that you go and discover what is Afghanistan. It's always constructed by such kind of accounts, which was written by anthropologists, historians, novelists, right, and so on and so forth. And Afghanistan, that's why the way it is represented should be deconstructed. It's not natural. So I will stop here, and now